This video contains discussions of death and disappearance that may be distressing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine for a moment that it's 1967. President Lyndon B. Johnson, at the height of the Vietnam War, decides to take a weekend trip to the coast. He tells his Secret Service he's just going for a quick swim. He wades into the Atlantic Ocean and is never seen again. No body, no ransom note, no wreckage. The leader of the free world simply gone, vanished into the waves. The political chaos, the international panic, the endless terrifying questions. It sounds like the plot of a political thriller, but for the nation of Australia, this isn't fiction. This is exactly what happened to their Prime Minister. His name was Harold Holt, and on a hot, windy Sunday in December of 1967, he walked into the turbulent surf of a remote beach and was erased from history. This wasn't a quiet retirement. This was the sitting leader of a key American ally, a man with his finger on the pulse of Cold War secrets, disappearing off the face of the earth in broad daylight. The official story is that he drowned, the victim of a treacherous rip current. Tragic but simple accident. But the deeper you dig, the more that simple story begins to unravel. Because when a world leader vanishes without a trace, it's never simple. Was it a freak accident? A desperate act of suicide by a man under immense pressure? Or was it something else? An assassination so perfect, so elegant in its execution, that it was disguised as a common beach tragedy? A Cold War hit, carried out in the waves, leaving behind no evidence but an ocean of unanswered questions. To understand how a prime minister could just disappear, you first have to understand the man himself and the powder keg of a world he inhabited. Harold Holt was not your typical stuffy politician. When he took office in 1966, he was a breath of fresh air for Australia. He was charismatic, athletic, a skilled spear fisherman who loved the ocean. He represented a modern, forward-looking nation stepping out of the shadow of its colonial past. He replaced the legendary Sir Robert Menzies, a towering figure who had led the country for a staggering 16 years. Holt was the new generation. He was Australia's JFK. And just like JFK, he took power at a critical turning point in history. The Cold War was raging, and its hottest front was in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War was escalating, and Australia was one of America's most crucial allies in the fight. The United States needed boots on the ground, and Harold Holt delivered. He dramatically increased Australia's military commitment, introducing conscription, a national draft, that sent thousands of young Australian men, many just 20 years old, to fight alongside American GIs. His personal relationship with the American President Lyndon B. Johnson was the cornerstone of his foreign policy. During a visit to the White House, Holt gave a speech that would come to define his legacy and some say seal his fate. Standing on the South Lawn, he looked at LBJ and declared that Australia was all the way with LBJ. It wasn't just a political slogan, it was a blank check. It bound Australia's fate to America's war, for better or for worse. For President Johnson, Holt was the perfect ally. Loyal, committed, and willing to pay the political price back home. But that price was steep. As the war dragged on, and Australian casualties mounted, the public mood began to sour. The all the way with LBJ mantra, once a symbol of staunch alliance, started to sound like blind obedience. Anti-war protests, once small, erupted into massive demonstrations across the country. Holt, the popular modern leader, found himself facing a deeply divided nation. He was branded a warmonger, an American puppet. The pressure was immense. His political opponents smelled blood in the water, and whispers began to circulate within his own party that his leadership was faltering. But the political pressure was only part of the story. There were personal struggles too. Rumors of a long-standing affair, financial worries, and a growing sense of exhaustion. He was a man carrying the weight of a nation at war, while battling his own private demons. And then there were the secrets. As Prime Minister, Harold Holt was privy to the highest levels of intelligence from both Australia and its allies, including the United States and Britain. He knew things. He knew about troop movements, covert operations, and the secret underbelly of the Cold War. One of the most sensitive secrets on his desk was a highly classified American installation being built on Australian soil, a satellite communications base called Pine Gap. Even today, Pine Gap is one of the most important and secretive intelligence facilities the U.S. operates outside its own borders. In 1967, its existence was barely known, a ghost in the vast Australian desert. But Harold Holt knew exactly what it was for. He had personally approved it. He knew it was a vital link in America's global spy network, a key to monitoring Soviet missile tests and military communications. He also knew that its presence made Australia a prime target in the event of a nuclear war. Some historians now believe that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Holt was having second thoughts. He was growing concerned that the all the way with LBJ promise had gone too far, that Australia had given up too much of its sovereignty. Was he considering a change in policy? A pivot away from the United States? The very thought would have sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. A man with that much power, with that kind of classified knowledge, having a change of heart during the peak of the Cold War, is a dangerous man. Which brings us back to that day. Sunday, December 17, 1967. It wasn't just any day. A few days prior, Holt had been in his office looking tired and unwell. He was suffering from a painful shoulder injury, and friends said he seemed distracted, withdrawn. Yet on that Sunday morning he seemed almost unnaturally cheerful. He drove himself, without his usual security detail, down the winding coastal roads to a place called Cheviot Beach. It was a rugged, isolated stretch of coastline known for its ferocious waves and deadly rip currents. It was not a place for the casual swimmer. He was with friends who watched from the shore as he surveyed the churning, violent water. One of them, a woman named Marjorie Gillespie, would later say she warned him, "I wouldn't go in there, it looks terribly rough." Holt just smiled. He reportedly said, "I know this beach like the back of my hand." It was a statement of supreme confidence from a man who had swum here his entire life. He changed into his swimming trunks, walked across the sand, and without hesitation, strode into the raging surf. His companions watched as the Prime Minister swam further and further out, battling the chaotic waves. And then in an instant the ocean seemed to erupt around him. A massive swell of turbulent, white water rose up and crashed down, and when it cleared he was gone. They waited. They scanned the waves, their casual beach outing turning into a nightmare. But there was nothing. Just the endless, gray, violent ocean. The Prime Minister of Australia had vanished. The largest sea and air search in the nation's history would be launched, but they would find absolutely nothing. No body, no clothing, not a single trace. It was as if the sea had opened up and swallowed him whole. A man who knew the most sensitive secrets of the Western world was gone, leaving behind only a question that haunts his country to this day. Did he simply swim out too far, or was he pulled under by something far more sinister than a rip current? To understand what happened next, you have to picture the scene. Cheviot Beach isn't a postcard-perfect tourist spot. It's a rugged, isolated cove flanked by steep, scrub-covered cliffs. And on that day, December 17, 1967, the ocean was angry. The tide was unusually high, the surf was violent, churning the water into what one witness later called a cauldron. It was the kind of water that even experienced locals knew to respect, to fear. The four people on the beach with Harold Holt watched him wade in. They were his friend, Marjorie Gillespie, her daughter, her daughter's boyfriend, and another young man. They watched as the 59-year-old Prime Minister, a man known for his love of the ocean and spearfishing, confidently entered the turbulent water. He swam out, his head bobbing in the waves. And then he was gone. For a moment there was just disbelief. He was a strong swimmer. He knew this coastline. He'd be back up any second. But the seconds stretched into a minute, then two. Panic began to set in. The group scanned the churning gray water, their eyes straining to see his familiar shock of white hair. There was nothing, just the relentless crashing of the waves against the shore. The two younger men, despite the danger, tried to get into the water to search, but the undertow was too powerful. It was suicide. The realization dawned on them with cold, terrifying certainty. The most powerful man in their country had just vanished before their very eyes. The alarm was raised. What followed was the largest search and rescue operation in Australian history up to that point. The initial call went out to local police, but the gravity of the situation escalated with breathtaking speed. Within hours, that wild, secluded beach was transformed into a military-style command center. Helicopters clattered overhead, their rotor wash whipping the sea spray into the faces of the searchers on the sand. Police boats and private vessels joined the effort, crisscrossing the bay, their occupants staring into the depths. Soon, the elite forces arrived. Teams of Royal Australian Navy divers, the best in the country, were brought in. They were equipped to handle the most challenging conditions, but even they were stunned by the ferocity of Cheviot Beach. The underwater visibility was near zero. The surge was so powerful it threw the divers against submerged rocks and reefs like rag dolls. Thick, treacherous beds of kelp snagged their equipment, threatening to drag them down into the same abyss that had likely claimed the Prime Minister. One of the lead divers later described it as the worst conditions he had ever dived in, saying, "It was like a washing machine in the dark." For 2 days they risked their lives, plunging into the violent water again and again. They found nothing. Not a scrap of his swimming trunks, not a trace of the man himself. As the search operation ramped up, the news began to break, first in whispers, then in a torrent of shocked headlines that reverberated around the globe. In 1967, the world was a powder keg. The Cold War was at its peak. The Vietnam War was raging, and Australia was one of America's staunchest allies, with over 50,000 Australian troops having served. Harold Holt wasn't just some obscure leader from a faraway land. He was a critical partner to the United States. He had famously coined the phrase, "all the way with LBJ," pledging unwavering support to President Lyndon B. Johnson and the American war effort. When the news reached the White House, it was met with disbelief and alarm. A key ally, a personal friend of the president, had simply disappeared? In an era of assassinations and covert operations, the immediate assumption wasn't a simple swimming accident. The CIA, the State Department, the entire American intelligence apparatus lit up. Was it the Soviets? The Chinese? Had he been kidnapped? Assassinated? The implications were staggering. Back in Australia, the nation was paralyzed. Radio and television programs were interrupted with solemn news bulletins. People gathered in the streets talking in hushed, anxious tones. It was unthinkable. Leaders didn't just vanish. The country was left rudderless, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and fear. The search continued for 5 long days, a massive, expensive, and ultimately fruitless effort. The land search was just as intense. Police and army volunteers scoured every inch of the coastline, hacking through dense bushland, peering into caves and crevices, hoping to find any sign that he might have been washed ashore. They found nothing. Perhaps the most haunting part of this immediate aftermath was the reaction of Holt's wife, Zara. When she was informed that her husband was missing, presumed drowned, her response was not what anyone expected. It was one of stoic, almost unnerving calm. She flew down to the search area, but she refused to hold out any false hope. She told the authorities not to endanger any more lives by searching for a body. In a statement that would be endlessly analyzed for years to come, she said, "He loved the sea. I would not want him to have to leave it." For many, it was the graceful acceptance of a grieving widow. For others, it was strangely detached, adding another layer of mystery to an already baffling event. Finally, on December 22nd, 5 days after Harold Holt swam out into the waves, the official search was called off. With no body, no witnesses to his final moments, and no evidence of foul play, the government was forced to make a declaration. The Prime Minister of Australia was officially presumed dead, lost to the sea. The official cause was listed as accidental drowning. A memorial service was held, attended by world leaders including President Johnson, who flew halfway around the world to pay his respects to his lost friend. But a memorial service couldn't provide what the country and the world desperately needed: closure. An official explanation couldn't erase the fundamental weirdness of it all. How could a man, the leader of a nation surrounded by people, simply cease to exist in broad daylight? The ocean had swallowed him whole, leaving behind no clues, no answers, only a void. And into that void, 1,000 questions began to rush. The official story, that a 59-year-old man, tired from a long year, overestimated his strength in a rough sea, was plausible. It was simple, but for many it felt too simple. People began to look closer at the man himself. They started asking about his health, his state of mind in the days and weeks leading up to that final swim. And what they began to uncover suggested that Harold Holt was a man under immense pressure, a man carrying burdens that nobody, not even those closest to him, fully understood. The story of a simple accident was about to get a whole lot more complicated. To understand what happened in the violent surf of Cheviot Beach, You first have to understand the turbulent waters Harold Holt was navigating long before he ever touched the ocean that day. The year 1967 was a pressure cooker, and the Prime Minister of Australia was feeling the heat from every conceivable direction. Publicly, his leadership was being defined and perhaps consumed by one of the most divisive conflicts of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. Holt had inherited Australia's commitment to the war from his predecessor, the towering political giant Sir Robert Menzies. But where Menzies had been cautious, Holt was effusive. On a visit to the White House in 1966, seeking to solidify his relationship with President Lyndon B. Johnson, Holt stood on the South Lawn and uttered a phrase that would echo through Australian history, a phrase that would become both his rallying cry and his political epitaph, "All the way with LBJ." For a United States audience, it might be hard to grasp just how seismic those 5 words were. This wasn't just a statement of support, it was a blank check. Holt was tying Australia's destiny, its treasure, and the lives of its young men to America's war effort with an enthusiasm that shocked even some in his own government. He tripled the number of Australian troops in Vietnam, and most controversially, he introduced conscription, a military draft that sent 20-year-old men, chosen by a lottery of birth dates, to fight in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Suddenly, a distant war was devastatingly close. Australian families were seeing their sons, brothers, and husbands sent off to fight and die in a conflict many didn't support or understand. The country began to fracture. The initial wave of support for the war gave way to a growing tide of protest. University campuses became hotbeds of dissent. Moratorium marches filled the streets of Sydney and Melbourne, with protesters chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And every attack, every protest, was aimed squarely at the man who had declared Australia was in it all the way, Harold Holt. He was a man caught in a vice. On one side, he had the immense pressure from Washington to remain a staunch and reliable ally. On the other, he faced a growing chorus of outrage from his own people. He was no longer seen as the charming modern leader who had replaced the stuffy old guard. To a vocal and expanding segment of the population, he was a warmonger, a puppet of the United States. This wasn't just political disagreement, it was personal, it was venomous. Holt, a man who had always thrived on public affection, found himself becoming a figure of hate. But the war in Vietnam wasn't his only battle. He was fighting a war within his own party. Stepping into the shoes of Robert Menzies, who had been Prime Minister for a record-breaking 18 years, was like following a legend. Holt was constantly being compared to his predecessor, and many in the old guard of the Liberal Party saw him as too lightweight, too progressive, too friendly. They whispered in the corridors of Parliament House that he lacked Menzies' gravitas, his political cunning. Every decision he made was scrutinized, every misstep magnified. He was leading a government, but he was also constantly looking over his shoulder, aware of the sharks circling in his own political waters. The pressure was taking a visible toll. Friends and colleagues noted he was losing weight, that he seemed perpetually tired. He was suffering from a recurring and painful shoulder injury, which he often treated with morphine injections. Think about that for a moment. The leader of a country at war, making life and death decisions, was potentially clouded by chronic pain and powerful narcotics. This wasn't the image of the robust, energetic leader he projected to the world. It was the reality of a man stretched to his breaking point. And yet, all of this, the war, the protests, the political backstabbing, the physical pain, was only the part of the iceberg that was visible above the surface. The true weight Holt carried was hidden in a secret life. A life that, if exposed, would have utterly destroyed him in the conservative, buttoned-up world of 1960s Australia. Harold Holt was a man with secrets. He was married to a vibrant and formidable woman, Zara, but their marriage was, by many accounts, an arrangement more than a romance. For years, Holt had been engaged in a series of clandestine affairs. This wasn't just idle gossip. It was an open secret in the Canberra Press Gallery, a gentleman's agreement among journalists not to report on the private lives of politicians. But one affair was different. It wasn't a fleeting dalliance. It was a deep, long-term relationship with a woman named Marjorie Gillespie. And in a twist of fate that seems almost too cinematic to be true, Marjorie Gillespie and her family lived in a house right next door to the Holt's holiday home in Portsea. She was his neighbor, his confidant, his lover, and she was one of the 4 people on Cheviot Beach with him on the day he vanished. The complexity of this situation is staggering. The Prime Minister of Australia was carrying on a secret affair with his neighbor, often right under his own wife's nose. He would take phone calls from President Johnson, debate the deployment of troops, and then slip away for a clandestine meeting. It was a life lived on a knife's edge. In the 1960s, a scandal of this magnitude wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be career-ending. It would be a national disgrace. The hypocrisy would be unforgivable. The man sending young men to war for God and country, while betraying the sacred vows of his own marriage. This secret life adds a dark and compelling layer to his final days. Sources close to him, including his own press secretary, later revealed that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, the pressure of this double life was becoming unbearable. There were whispers that Holt was considering a monumental decision, one that would have sent shockwaves through the nation. He was thinking of leaving Zara for Marjorie. Now, picture that man again, standing on the edge of the shore at Cheviot Beach. This is not just a prime minister enjoying a day off. This is a man besieged. He is carrying the weight of an unpopular war that is killing his countrymen. He is facing down political enemies in the streets and in his own party. He is in chronic physical pain. And he is trapped in a web of personal secrets and lies that is threatening to unravel at any moment. The woman standing just feet away from him is not just a family friend. She is the center of that secret, the cause of his greatest joy and his most terrifying risk. The story of a simple, tragic accident begins to look insufficient. It doesn't account for the sheer crushing weight on this man's shoulders. People under that kind of pressure don't always act rationally. They make poor decisions. They take reckless chances. Or perhaps they look for a way out. The calm, confident facade he presented to the world was just that, a facade. Beneath it was a man in turmoil. A man juggling burdens that would have broken a lesser person. And on December 17, 1967, he took all of that pressure, all of that pain, and all of those secrets with him as he walked into the churning, unforgiving sea. The question is no longer just how a man could be swallowed by the waves. The question becomes, what was he thinking in those final moments on the sand? What was said in the car on the drive to the beach? Because the simple story of an accidental drowning was about to be challenged by the people who knew him best, starting with the very first and most shocking theory of all, that Harold Holt didn't drown by accident. He did it on purpose. The idea that a sitting prime minister would walk into the ocean to end his own life seems, on the surface, unthinkable. A desperate final act completely at odds with the public image of Harold Holt, the smiling, confident, energetic leader. But behind that public facade, the walls were closing in. To understand why some of his closest confidants, in their private moments of grief and confusion, whispered the word suicide, you have to understand the pressure cooker that was Harold Holt's life in late 1967. And it all started with a single fateful promise. All the way with LBJ. 3 little words spoken on the White House lawn a year earlier that had come to define his premiership and perhaps to seal his fate. This was Holt's public pledge of unwavering support for President Lyndon B. Johnson and the American war effort in Vietnam. For the United States, it was a massive public relations victory. A key ally in the Pacific was locking arms with them. For Harold Holt, it was a political masterstroke that won him a landslide election in 1966. But by December 1967, that promise had become an anchor, dragging him down into a sea of controversy. The Vietnam War was tearing the world apart, and Australia was no exception. The initial public support had curdled into bitter, angry division. Holt had introduced conscription, a national draft that sent thousands of young Australian men, many just 20 years old, into the jungles of Southeast Asia. To a generation of parents, he was the man sending their sons to die in a foreign war they didn't understand. The nightly news was filled with images of flag-draped coffins returning home. University campuses were exploding with protests. Chants of "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" were often directed right at Holt. He was heckled, spat at, and labeled a warmonger and a puppet of the United States. Imagine being the man who has to stand before your nation and justify that sacrifice. Imagine looking into the eyes of grieving mothers while defending a war whose progress was measured in body counts. The weight of that responsibility was immense. Colleagues noted a change in him. The trademark optimism was flickering. He seemed tired, worn down by the constant barrage of criticism. The war was a political quagmire with no clear end in sight, and he was the face of it. Every casualty report, every protest was a personal blow. But the war in Vietnam wasn't the only battle Holt was fighting. His own political party, the Liberal Party, was beginning to fracture. A power struggle was brewing right under his nose. Two of his most ambitious ministers, William McMahon and John Gorton, were circling like sharks, sensing weakness. Cabinet meetings became tense, fraught with backstabbing and political maneuvering. Holt, who had always thrived on consensus and charm, found himself struggling to command the loyalty of his own team. He was fighting a war abroad and a war within his own government. On top of it all, the Australian economy was sputtering. A major trading partner, Great Britain, had just devalued its currency, the pound sterling, sending shockwaves through the Australian economy. Holt was now faced with an impossible choice. Follow Britain's lead and devalue the Australian dollar, which would anger farmers and the rural base of his coalition partners, or hold firm, which would infuriate manufacturers and exporters. He was trapped. No matter what he did, he would alienate a powerful segment of his own supporters. He was being attacked from the left over the war, and from the right over the economy. The political ground beneath his feet was crumbling. This crushing professional pressure would have been enough to break many men. But Harold Holt's private life was just as turbulent. For years, he had been carrying on a clandestine affair with a woman named Marjorie Gillespie, the very same woman who was on the beach with him that fateful day. This wasn't just a casual fling. It was a deep, long-term relationship. Their two families even owned neighboring vacation homes at Port Sea. They were deeply enmeshed in each other's lives, all under the nose of Holt's formidable wife, Zara. The risk of exposure was catastrophic. In the socially conservative Australia of the 1960s, a prime minister being exposed as an adulterer would have been an extinction-level scandal. It would have meant the end of his career, public humiliation, and personal ruin. Was the secret about to come out? Was someone threatening to expose him? We don't know. But the constant fear, the double life, the emotional toll of such a deception must have been exhausting. Adding another layer to this private turmoil was Holt's physical health. He was 59 years old and the job was taking its toll. He had a painful recurring shoulder injury that made simple movements agonizing. He was known to take medication, sometimes described as pep pills, to keep up with his punishing schedule. There were rumors, later confirmed by some staff, that he had collapsed in his office on at least 2 separate occasions in the months leading up to his disappearance. He was projecting an image of vigor and vitality, spearfishing, swimming, living life to the fullest, but privately, his body may have been failing him. He was a man in pain both physically and emotionally. So let's go back to that Sunday at Cheviot Beach. Picture this man. Not the smiling prime minister, but the man underneath. A man haunted by the deaths of young soldiers he sent to war. A leader whose party is turning on him. A steward of an economy on the brink of crisis. A husband deceiving his wife. A lover terrified of exposure. A man in constant physical pain, possibly exhausted and medicated. Does his decision to enter that violent, churning water still look like a simple miscalculation? Or does it look like something else? Proponents of the suicide theory argue that this was a man at his absolute breaking point. That he saw the turbulent ocean not as a threat, but as an escape. A final, decisive act to end the unbearable pressure of a life that was unraveling on all fronts. His last words to Marjorie Gillespie, "I know this beach like the back of my hand," take on a chilling new meaning in this light. It wasn't a statement of confidence. It was a statement of intent. He knew exactly how dangerous it was. He knew what those waves could do. And he walked in anyway. He didn't leave a note. But for some, his actions that day were the note. A final, desperate message written in the waves. The story of a simple drowning was now competing with the tragic portrait of a powerful man who had lost the will to live. It was a shocking, deeply personal theory that painted his disappearance not as an accident, but as the ultimate act of a man cornered by his own life. And yet, as compelling as this theory of a tragic, secret suicide is, it was soon overshadowed by a new possibility. A theory so wild, so audacious, that it would transform the disappearance of Harold Holt from a national tragedy into a full-blown international espionage thriller. Because what if Harold Holt didn't drown by accident, and he didn't die by suicide? What if he swam out to that churning water to meet a submarine that was waiting for him? A submarine sent by a foreign power that he had been secretly working for all along. This is the theory that transformed the Harold Holt case from a national tragedy into a global conspiracy. A story so wild, so cinematic, it sounds like something straight out of a Cold War spy novel. But for a shocking number of people, it's not fiction. It's the truth. The story goes that Harold Holt, the 17th Prime Minister of Australia, a man who stood shoulder to shoulder with President Lyndon B. Johnson, a man who committed Australian troops to fight and die in Vietnam, was a spy. And not just any spy. A long-term deep-cover sleeper agent for the People's Republic of China. This explosive claim was first laid out in detail by a British journalist named Anthony Gray in his 1983 book, The Prime Minister Was a Spy. Now it's easy to dismiss a title like that. It sounds like pure pulp fiction. But Gray wasn't some crackpot. He was a respected foreign correspondent who had been held under house arrest in Beijing for 2 years by the Chinese government. He had sources, and he claimed one of them was a high-level Chinese defector who laid out the entire operation. According to this version of events, Holt's story didn't begin in the Prime Minister's office. It began decades earlier in his youth. The theory alleges that Holt was recruited by Chinese intelligence as a young man, long before he ever entered politics. He was what's known in the spy world as a legal, not a professional intelligence officer, but a citizen of a target country who uses their own career to climb the ladder, all while secretly serving a foreign master. For years he played the part perfectly. He rose through the ranks of the Liberal Party, became a cabinet minister, and eventually the leader of his country. All the while, he was allegedly feeding information to Beijing. But why? What was the motive? Proponents of the theory point to a fascinating and complex picture of the man. They say Holt was a pragmatist. He saw the writing on the wall. He believed that America's war in Vietnam was a catastrophic mistake, a losing battle that would destabilize the entire region. He saw the future of Australia not as a junior partner to the United States or a relic of the British Empire, but as a nation integrated with Asia. And the dominant power in Asia, the rising dragon, was China. The theory claims Holt believed Australia's long-term survival depended on aligning with Beijing, and he was willing to do anything to make that happen, even betray his closest allies. He publicly chanted "all the way with LBJ," sending Australian boys into the jungle while privately, he was working to undermine the entire war effort from within. It was a long con, the ultimate act of political espionage. But by late 1967, the walls were supposedly closing in. Allied intelligence agencies, maybe even the CIA itself, were getting suspicious. There were whispers, rumors of a high-level mole inside the Australian government. The pressure was mounting. Holt knew his time was up. He was either going to be exposed, arrested, and disgraced, sparking an international scandal that would cripple his country, or he could disappear. And that's where the submarine comes in. The plan, as laid out by Gray, was an exfiltration, a meticulously planned escape. Cheviot Beach wasn't a random spot for a swim. It was a prearranged rendezvous point. The treacherous water wasn't a danger. It was cover. The story goes that on that Sunday, Holt wasn't just going for a casual dip. He was equipped for a mission. Some versions claim he had a small breathing apparatus, others that he was a strong enough swimmer to make the distance on his own. He walked into that churning surf, seemingly to his doom, but instead of being pulled under, he swam. He swam past the breakers to a waiting Chinese submarine, submerged just out of sight. Imagine the scene. A frogman emerges from the water to meet him, helps him through the hatch, and as the sub silently slips beneath the waves, Harold Holt, Prime Minister of Australia, vanishes from the face of the earth. He was taken to China, where he allegedly lived out the rest of his days as a guest of the communist government, a hero to his true masters. His death was the perfect cover story. A tragic accident. No body, no evidence, no questions asked. This theory, as wild as it sounds, started to gain traction because it seemed to explain some of the oddities surrounding the case. It explained why no body was ever found. There was no body to find. It explained his seemingly reckless decision to enter the water. It wasn't reckless, it was deliberate. It even offered a potential explanation for reports that after his disappearance, his prime ministerial briefcase, which should have been under lock and key, was found open and rifled through. Was someone trying to remove incriminating evidence? Of course, the Australian government, Holt's family, and historians have furiously denied these claims. They call it a disgusting, baseless fantasy. They point out that Holt was a staunch anti-communist. They highlight that the Chinese Navy at the time barely had submarines capable of making such a long and risky journey undetected. They argue that Holt's support for the Vietnam War was genuine and unwavering. His son, Sam Holt, who was there on the beach that day, called the theory utter nonsense, an insult to his father's memory. To them, Anthony Gray was just a sensationalist author selling books by smearing a good man's name. And for a long time, that's where the story stood. A wild, unsubstantiated conspiracy theory on one side, and total indignant denial on the other. It was easy to dismiss the submarine story as just that, a story. A compelling one for sure, but ultimately a fiction. It seemed destined to remain on the fringes, a bizarre footnote in Australian history. But then something happened that dragged the theory kicking and screaming back into the mainstream. A new source emerged. Not a shadowy foreign defector, but someone from the inside. A former Australian naval officer who claimed he had a secret to tell. A secret he had kept for decades. He claimed that on the weekend Harold Holt disappeared, he had been working at a top-secret communications facility. And he saw something. Something that the official story insisted wasn't there. He saw a cryptic message that suggested an unknown submarine had been detected right off the coast of Victoria. But the most chilling part of his story wasn't that he saw a submarine. It was who the submarine belonged to. Because according to this new witness, the submarine lurking in the waters off Cheviot Beach that day wasn't Chinese at all. It was American. An American submarine. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a hostile power from behind the Iron Curtain. Not a regional rival. But America, Australia's big brother. Its staunchest ally. The nation Harold Holt had personally tethered Australia's fate to with his famous declaration, "All the way with LBJ." The idea is so jarring, so contrary to everything we know about the relationship between these two countries, that it sounds like fiction. But the man who made this claim was very real. His name was Peter Playford. In 1967, he was a 19-year-old Army clerk, spending his weekend at the officer cadet school just a stone's throw from Cheviot Beach. He wasn't some random person looking for attention. He was a soldier. And what he said he saw that day would form the bedrock of one of the most explosive theories in Australian history. Playford claimed that on the afternoon of December 17th, he was at the barracks when he looked out towards the ocean. What he saw stopped him cold. A submarine surfaced in the turbulent waters just off the coast. But that wasn't all. He saw a small boat, a dinghy, moving from the beach toward the sub. And in that dinghy, he saw several figures in wetsuits, frogmen, and what appeared to be a body, being loaded from the boat onto the submarine. He watched as the sub sealed its hatches, submerged beneath the waves, and vanished. At the time, he didn't connect it to the Prime Minister's disappearance. He just thought it was some kind of secret military exercise. It was only later, when the news broke that Harold Holt was missing from that exact spot, that the pieces clicked together in his mind with horrifying clarity. For years, Peter Playford kept his story to himself. Who would believe him? A low-level army clerk claiming the US Navy had just abducted the Australian Prime Minister? It was career suicide. But eventually, he came forward, and his testimony opened a Pandora's box of questions, the biggest of which is simply why? Why on earth would the United States government want to harm, let alone assassinate, the leader of its most loyal ally? Especially a leader who was sending thousands of his country's young men to fight and die alongside Americans in Vietnam? To understand this theory, you have to look past the public smiles and handshakes. You have to look at what was happening behind the scenes in the high-stakes chess game of the Cold War. Proponents of this theory, most notably author Anthony Gray in his book, The Prime Minister Was a Spy, argue that Harold Holt wasn't the steadfast ally he appeared to be. They claim that by late 1967, Holt was having a crisis of conscience. He had visited the battlefields of Vietnam, seen the brutal reality of the war, and was beginning to have serious doubts. The theory goes that Holt was planning a major policy shift, a withdrawal of Australian troops from Vietnam. For President Lyndon B. Johnson, this would have been an absolute catastrophe. The Vietnam War was already deeply unpopular at home. The US was desperate for international allies to lend the conflict legitimacy. If Australia, America's staunchest supporter, pulled out, it could create a domino effect. Other allied nations might follow suit, leaving the United States isolated on the world stage. The political fallout for LBJ would have been devastating. In the ruthless calculus of Cold War politics, A wavering ally could be seen as a greater threat than an open enemy. And the CIA at the time had a well-documented history of dealing with leaders who fell out of line with American interests. From Iran to Guatemala to the Congo, the agency had a playbook for regime change. Could Harold Holt have been their next target? But even a potential withdrawal from Vietnam seems like an insufficient motive for such a drastic and risky operation. There had to be something more. And according to this theory, there was. It was a secret so sensitive, so vital to America's global military strategy, that they would do literally anything to protect it. The secret was buried in the barren, red desert of the Australian outback, at a place called Pine Gap. Today, Pine Gap is well known as a joint U.S.-Australian satellite surveillance base. But in 1967 it was brand new, top secret, and its true purpose was known to only a handful of people. The official story was that it was a joint space research facility. The reality, as we now know, was that it was the CIA's ground station for a new generation of spy satellites. These satellites could hoover up electronic communications from across Asia, monitor Soviet missile tests, and pinpoint targets for American bombers. Pine Gap was, and still is, one of the most important U.S. intelligence facilities on the entire planet. And it was on Australian soil. Harold Holt had personally approved its construction. But the theory alleges that Holt was beginning to realize he'd been sold a lie. He believed it would be a truly joint facility, a partnership. Instead, he was discovering that the CIA was running the show completely, keeping Australian personnel in the dark, and using the base for operations that Australia had never agreed to. He reportedly felt deceived, and he was angry. The final straw, according to this theory, came when Holt learned that Pine Gap was being used to target American B-52 bombing raids in Cambodia, a neutral country. This was a secret, illegal war, and it was being orchestrated from a base on Australian soil, making Australia complicit without its knowledge or consent. Holt was allegedly furious and was preparing to make a public statement in the new year. He was going to expose the true nature of Pine Gap, revealing its secrets to the Australian people and the world. Imagine the consequences. It would have been a global scandal. It would have jeopardized America's entire global surveillance network, a cornerstone of its Cold War strategy. It would have shattered the alliance with Australia and potentially led to the expulsion of all U.S. forces from the continent. From the perspective of the CIA's most ruthless operators, Harold Holt had become more than just a problem. He had become an existential threat. And threats in their world are neutralized. So the stage is set. A prime minister on the verge of exposing a devastating secret, a superpower with everything to lose, and a witness, a soldier, who claims he saw an American submarine with a team of frogmen taking a body from the very beach where that prime minister disappeared. It's a chilling cinematic plot. The perfect assassination. No bullets, no bomb, no evidence. Just an unpredictable ocean to blame it on. A tragic accident. Case closed. It's an incredible story. But is it true? Skeptics point out that Peter Playford's account has changed over the years. He didn't come forward for over a decade, and no other witness among the hundreds of people at the military base that day reported seeing a submarine. Furthermore, many historians argue that there is no hard evidence Holt was planning to pull out of Vietnam or expose Pine Gap. They say his public and private communications showed unwavering support for the American alliance right up to his death. The theory seems to teeter on the testimony of one man. A story so wild it could easily be dismissed as fantasy. Except for one thing. The most compelling piece of evidence suggesting American involvement didn't come from a lone witness on a cliffside. It came from a secret memo, written by one of the most powerful men in Australia, and discovered decades later, buried deep within the archives of the White House itself. The document was a top-secret briefing note, prepared in the frantic days after Holt vanished. It was written for the incoming Prime Minister, John Gorton, by the most senior public servant in the country, Sir John Bunting, the head of the Prime Minister's department. Bunting was the ultimate insider, a man of immense discretion and power, who saw and heard everything. His job was to prepare the new leader for the challenges ahead, to brief him on the nation's deepest secrets. And in this memo, intended only for the eyes of the new Prime Minister and President Lyndon B. Johnson, Bunting laid out the simmering rumors and whispers that were circulating at the highest levels of government. He wrote that while the official explanation was accidental drowning, other possibilities could not be dismissed. And then he dropped the bombshell. He noted the theory that Holt had been assassinated on the orders of the United States. This wasn't some fringe conspiracy blog. This was the head of the Australian government, in a classified document for the new Prime Minister, acknowledging that a plausible theory being discussed in the halls of power was that their closest and most powerful ally had just murdered their leader. The memo didn't endorse the theory, but the very fact it was included in such a high-level briefing was staggering. It meant the idea was considered credible enough, dangerous enough, that the new Prime Minister needed to be warned. But why? Why on earth would the United States want to eliminate Harold Holt? To the public, he was America's greatest friend. He was the man who, on the White House lawn, had looked at President Johnson and coined the famous phrase, "All the way with LBJ," pledging Australia's unwavering support in the Vietnam War. He had tripled the number of Australian troops fighting alongside Americans. On the surface, the alliance had never been stronger. But behind the closed doors of the cabinet room, a very different story was unfolding. By late 1967, Harold Holt was having serious doubts. The war was going badly. The promised quick victory was nowhere in sight. The body count was rising and dissent was growing back home in Australia, just as it was in the United States. Holt, the ever-loyal ally, was beginning to feel that Australia had been sold a false bill of goods. He started questioning American strategy. He privately expressed deep concern about the scale of the bombing campaigns in North Vietnam and the endless bloody stalemate on the ground. He was a pragmatist, and he could see that the war, as it was being fought, was unwinnable. According to his colleagues and his press secretary, Holt was planning a major policy shift. He was considering capping Australia's troop commitment, refusing to send any more soldiers into the meat grinder. More radically, he was contemplating a gradual withdrawal. He was reportedly preparing to deliver a major speech that would signal this change in direction, a speech that would effectively declare that Australia was no longer going all the way with LBJ. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the Johnson administration in Washington, D.C. It's 1967. The Vietnam War is tearing your country apart. You're facing massive protests at home. The international community is condemning you. Your entire political future, the legacy of your presidency, hinges on this war. And your staunchest, most vocal ally, the one you hold up as proof that this isn't just an American war, but a fight for the free world, is about to pull the rug out from under you. If Australia, the country that was all the way with you, started to back out, the political fallout would be catastrophic. It would create a domino effect, encouraging other allies to abandon the cause. It would be a public relations nightmare, and a devastating blow to American morale and credibility. From the cold, hard perspective of a clandestine intelligence agency, a wavering Australian Prime Minister wasn't just a political problem. He was a strategic threat. And in the ruthless world of Cold War geopolitics, strategic threats were sometimes neutralized. The motive was there and it was powerful. But what about the means and the opportunity? This is where another secret, hidden deep in the Australian desert, enters the story. A place called Pine Gap. Just a year before Holt disappeared, his government had signed a treaty with the United States to build a top-secret satellite surveillance base near Alice Springs. It was, and still is, one of the most important and sensitive American intelligence facilities on the planet. Run by the CIA and the NSA, Pine Gap was America's eyes and ears in the Southern Hemisphere, capable of intercepting missile telemetry from the Soviet Union and communications from across Asia. Its existence was a cornerstone of the U.S.-Australia Intelligence Alliance. But Holt was reportedly having second thoughts about this too. He was becoming increasingly concerned about the lack of Australian oversight at the facility. He worried that he had signed away a piece of Australian sovereignty, allowing a foreign power to conduct secret operations from Australian soil with almost total autonomy. He began pushing for more Australian control, more access for his own intelligence services. For the CIA, this was unacceptable. Pine Gap was their crown jewel. They would not tolerate any interference, especially not from the leader of a country they considered a junior partner. A prime minister asking too many questions, demanding too much control over a vital American intelligence asset, could be seen as another unacceptable threat. Suddenly, the wild theory starts to look chillingly plausible. You have a motive: preventing a devastating political blow in the Vietnam War, and protecting a critical intelligence asset. You have the means: the CIA, an agency with a well-documented history of covert operations, toppling governments, and political assassinations. And you have the opportunity. A prime minister who loved to swim in dangerous, isolated locations with minimal security. A team of trained operatives, perhaps from U.S. Navy SEAL teams who were known to operate in the region, could have easily staged an accident. In the violent, churning surf of Cheviot Beach, it would be simple. A quick abduction, a body disposed of far out at sea. No witnesses, no evidence, no bullet holes. Just a tragic, unfortunate drowning. The perfect crime. This is the scenario that Sir John Bunting felt was credible enough to include in his top-secret brief to the new Prime Minister. He was essentially telling his new boss, "Be careful. The world is a much more dangerous place than you think, and our friends can be just as dangerous as our enemies." The memo is the closest thing we have to a smoking gun. It's not proof that the CIA killed Harold Holt, but it is undeniable proof that the people at the very top of the Australian government believed it was a possibility. They looked at the escalating tensions over Vietnam, the secrecy around Pine Gap, and the sudden, convenient disappearance of their leader, and they saw a pattern that was deeply disturbing. They saw the ghost of American intervention. But the Americans weren't the only global superpower with a vested interest in Australia. As the Cold War raged, another power was rising in the East, a nation that viewed Australia as a key strategic piece on the global chessboard. A nation with its own powerful intelligence services and its own reasons for wanting Harold Holt gone. And this leads us to the second and perhaps even more outlandish theory. The one that doesn't involve CIA assassins in wetsuits, but a Chinese submarine, waiting silently in the deep waters just beyond the shore. This theory exploded into the public consciousness in 1983 with a book titled The Prime Minister Was a Spy, by British author and journalist Anthony Gray. And the story it tells is something straight out of a John le Carré novel. According to Gray, Harold Holt wasn't the affable pro-American leader he appeared to be. He was, in fact, a sleeper agent, a mole recruited by the Chinese intelligence service way back in the 1930s. For decades, he had supposedly been feeding information to Beijing, a long-game asset who had finally, improbably, risen to the highest office in the land. The book paints a picture of a man living a double life. His public support for the Vietnam War? A clever deception. His close relationship with President Johnson? A masterful piece of acting designed to give him access to the deepest secrets of the Western Alliance. Gray alleged that Holt had become increasingly disillusioned with the war, and was terrified that his cover was about to be blown. His espionage, the theory goes, was on the verge of being exposed, and he faced certain ruin, disgrace, and imprisonment. So his Chinese handlers devised an audacious, high-stakes exit plan. The rendezvous point was set. A secluded beach, a specific day, a specific time. Cheviot Beach, December 17, 1967. The plan, according to the book, was for a Chinese submarine to surface just offshore. A team of highly trained frogmen would then swim to the beach, locate their asset, the Prime Minister of Australia, and escort him back to the submarine, which would then slip away into the depths of the Pacific, taking Holt to a new life of safety and anonymity in China. In this version of events, Holt's seemingly casual trip to Port C wasn't casual at all. It was the culmination of a meticulously planned extraction. His insistence on swimming, despite the dangerous conditions, wasn't a reckless whim. It was a necessary part of the plan. He had to get into the water to meet his rescuers. His disappearance beneath the waves wasn't a drowning. It was a successful retrieval. As his friends watched in horror from the shore, they weren't witnessing a tragedy, but the final act of an elaborate escape. This theory, as you can imagine, caused an absolute firestorm. It was sensational. It was scandalous. And for some, it seemed to offer a neat, if shocking, explanation for an otherwise baffling event. It took the messy, unresolved mystery of his disappearance and replaced it with a clean cinematic narrative of espionage and escape. Proponents pointed to Holt's frequent travel throughout Asia as Prime Minister, framing it not as diplomacy, but as opportunities for him to meet with his handlers. They suggested his push to move Australia's focus away from its traditional European roots and towards Asia was part of a larger, pro-China agenda. The story was just so compelling. A sitting prime minister, a secret agent for a communist power, a daring submarine escape in broad daylight. It's the kind of plot Hollywood executives dream of, and for a while it captured the world's imagination. But as cinematic as this sounds, the moment you apply even a little bit of scrutiny, the entire story begins to fall apart, piece by piece. First, let's look at the source. Anthony Gray's explosive claims were based almost entirely on a single, anonymous source. A man he claimed was a former Australian naval officer who had decided to reveal the truth. There was no corroborating evidence, no second source, no leaked documents, just the word of one unidentified man, filtered through an author. This is a massive red flag. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in this case, the evidence was non-existent. Then there's the sheer logistical absurdity of the plan itself. Cheviot Beach is not a deep-water port. It's a notoriously violent stretch of coastline, famous for its treacherous surf, hidden rocks, and powerful rip currents. The idea that a massive nuclear-powered submarine from the 1960s could have navigated those waters, gotten close enough to shore to deploy divers, and then remained completely undetected is, to put it mildly, far-fetched. Naval experts have overwhelmingly dismissed the possibility. The water is too shallow, the conditions too volatile. The submarine would have likely run aground or been smashed against the rocks. And even if it could get close, the surf that day was described as a cauldron. Sending divers into that kind of churning water to find and retrieve one specific person would have been a suicide mission. Furthermore, there is absolutely zero evidence of any submarine, Chinese or otherwise, in the area at the time. Australia, as a key U.S. ally, had extensive underwater surveillance networks, especially around its southern coast. The United States Navy also had a massive presence in the region. The notion that a foreign submarine could sneak into one of the most heavily monitored areas, execute a covert operation, and then vanish without leaving a single trace, no sonar ping, no unusual radio traffic, nothing, stretches credulity to its breaking point. But the biggest hole in the theory is Holt himself. There is nothing in his personal history, his political career, or his private correspondence to suggest he was a communist sympathizer, let alone a long-term spy. He was a lifelong member of the Conservative Liberal Party. His government dramatically increased Australia's commitment to the Vietnam War, sending thousands more troops to fight alongside the Americans against the communist North Vietnamese. This is the exact opposite of what you'd expect from a secret agent for Beijing. His final days weren't filled with panicked preparations for an escape. They were filled with mundane government work. He was planning Christmas, working on policy papers, and looking forward to the new year. He acted in every observable way, like a man who expected to be prime minister for a long time to come. Holt's own family, including his wife Zara and his sons, have always been unequivocal in their dismissal of the theory. They knew the man better than anyone, and they described the claim as ludicrous, deeply hurtful, and a complete fabrication that bore no resemblance to the husband and father they knew. They saw a man who loved his country, who was under pressure, yes, but who was fundamentally a patriot. So, where does that leave us with the Chinese submarine theory? Well, it makes for a fantastic spy novel. It's a thrilling tale of intrigue and deception. But as a historical explanation for the disappearance of Harold Holt, it has virtually no basis in fact. It's a theory built on a single anonymous source, which proposes a logistically impossible event, and contradicts every known fact about the man it accuses. It's a conspiracy theory in the purest sense of the term, a dramatic story that offers a simple, exciting answer to a complex and painful question. It's far more exciting to imagine a secret agent escaping in a submarine than it is to accept the mundane, brutal reality of a man who was simply, and tragically, swallowed by the sea. And so, we are forced to discard another theory. If he wasn't assassinated by the CIA, and he didn't escape to China, then what other possibilities remain? Well, this is where the story takes a turn away from the geopolitical and towards deeply personal. Because the next theory doesn't involve spies or submarines. It involves a secret love affair, mounting personal pressures, and the desperate state of Harold Holt's mind. It suggests that perhaps his disappearance wasn't an accident, or an assassination, or an escape, but a choice. This theory doesn't require foreign powers or elaborate cover-ups. It requires only that we look at the man himself. Not Harold Holt the Prime Minister, the smiling, confident leader splashed across the newspapers, but Harold Holt the human being. A man who, by December 1967, was standing at the center of a perfect storm, one that was raging not in the ocean, but inside his own head. To understand this theory, you have to understand the three immense pressures that were crushing him from all sides. First, there was the political pressure. His job, Being Prime Minister of Australia was the culmination of a lifetime's ambition, but the dream had soured. The Vietnam War, a conflict he had passionately thrown Australia into, was becoming a bloody, unpopular quagmire. He had famously declared he was all the way with LBJ, tying his political fortune to President Lyndon B. Johnson and the American war effort. But as Australian casualties mounted and protests grew louder and more violent back home, that loyalty began to look like a fatal miscalculation. The public was turning on him. Worse, his own party was turning on him. Members of his cabinet were openly questioning his leadership. They saw him as weak, indecisive, a lightweight who had inherited the top job from the political giant Robert Menzies, but couldn't fill his shoes. There were whispers of a leadership challenge, a political coup to oust him from power. He had just suffered a series of embarrassing defeats in by-elections, a clear sign his government was on the ropes. He was losing control of the economy, losing the confidence of his colleagues, and losing the faith of the nation. For a man who had spent 40 years climbing the greasy pole of politics, the view from the top was terrifying. He wasn't standing on a peak, he was teetering on the edge of a cliff. The second pressure was intensely personal. It was the secret he had guarded for years. His long-standing love affair with his neighbor at Portsea, Marjorie Gillespie. This wasn't some casual fling. It was a deep, complicated relationship that had been the backdrop of his life for decades. Marjorie was married to one of his close friends. Her family and the Holt family were deeply intertwined. Their children played together. They spent holidays together. And all the while, Harold and Marjorie were living a second secret life. His wife, the formidable and outspoken Zara Holt, was well aware of the affair. She tolerated it, perhaps as a painful but necessary part of a political marriage. But in the intense glare of the Prime Minister's office, the secret was becoming impossible to keep. The press was getting bolder. Rumors were swirling through the capital. In the 1960s, a scandal of this magnitude would have been utterly ruinous. It wouldn't just end his career. It would destroy his reputation, humiliate his family, and disgrace the office he held. The double life he had managed for so long was becoming an unsustainable torment. He was trapped between the woman he loved, the wife he couldn't leave, and the public image he had to maintain. The weight of this deception was, by all accounts, immense. And then there was the third pressure, the one that's often overlooked: his physical health. Harold Holt was in constant, debilitating pain. A severe shoulder injury from a water-skiing accident years earlier had never properly healed. It plagued him daily, making simple acts like putting on a jacket an agonizing ordeal. To cope, he was taking a cocktail of medications. His doctors were giving him powerful painkillers, including, according to some reports, morphine-based drugs. He was also receiving regular cortisone injections, a steroid known to have significant side effects, including mood swings, depression, and impaired judgment. Just 2 days before he vanished on Friday, December 15th, Holt visited his doctor in Melbourne. The news wasn't good. His shoulder had deteriorated. He needed major surgery, an operation that would require a long and difficult recovery, forcing him to step away from his duties as Prime Minister at the very moment his leadership was most under threat. Imagine the scene. A man already politically besieged and emotionally entangled is now told that his body is failing him too. He is facing a future of physical pain and political oblivion. The three pillars of his life, his career, his love, and his health, were all crumbling at the exact same time. So let's return to that Sunday morning. December 17, 1967. Harold Holt wakes up at his beach house in Portsea. He is with Marjorie Gillespie. The pressure from their affair is mounting. He knows he's facing a political firestorm when he returns to Canberra. He knows a painful surgery looms on the horizon. He watches a lone yachtsman sailing on the turbulent waters and, according to witnesses, looks pensive, distant. He tells his companions he wants to go for a swim. They drive to Cheviot Beach, a place he knows is notoriously dangerous. The surf is high, the currents are violent. It's a beach that even the strongest local swimmers would avoid on a day like this. His friends warn him. Marjorie Gillespie reportedly pleads with him. "Don't go in too far, Harold." But he doesn't listen. He wades into the churning, boiling water without hesitation. Viewed through the lens of suicide, this is not the act of a reckless man overestimating his abilities. It is the act of a desperate man who has made a decision. The ocean isn't a challenge to be conquered, it's a solution. A final, irreversible escape from an unbearable reality. In this version of the story, Holt didn't misjudge the waves. He walked straight into them, embracing the chaos because it mirrored the chaos inside him. He let the sea take him, washing away the political failures, the secret love, the chronic pain, and the crushing weight of it all. It was a way out that left no note, no body, and no definitive proof, only an enduring mystery. Of course, those closest to him, including his wife Zara and his sons, vehemently rejected this theory. They argued that he had plans for the future. He was looking forward to Christmas. He had bought presents for his grandchildren. They say he was a fighter, not a quitter, and that despite the pressures he was in good spirits. They believe it was simply what it appeared to be. A tragic accident, a case of a man who loved the ocean and pushed his luck one too many times. They saw his final swim not as an act of despair, but as a final defiant act of a life lived to the fullest. But the evidence of his troubled state of mind is compelling. The sheer confluence of career, personal and health crises hitting all at once creates a powerful argument that Harold Holt had simply reached his breaking point. But a breaking point doesn't always lead to a premeditated exit. Sometimes it leads to a moment of catastrophic carelessness, a moment where judgment is so clouded by stress, exhaustion, and physical pain that a person makes a fatal error. And this brings us back to the other theories, from the fantastical to the mundane. Let's address the most cinematic theory first. The Chinese submarine. The idea that Harold Holt, a secret communist spy for decades, faked his own death to be whisked away by a waiting submarine and live out his days in Beijing. This theory, popularized by journalist Anthony Gray, is a product of its time. A Cold War thriller projected onto a real-life tragedy. It's a spectacular story. The problem? There is not a single shred of credible evidence to support it. Not one. The logistics are mind-boggling. Coordinating a submarine rendezvous off a rugged, unpredictable coastline, timed perfectly to a prime minister's impromptu swim, without a single soul in Australia's intelligence agencies or the CIA getting wind of it, stretches credulity to the breaking point. Furthermore, Holt's entire political career was built on a staunchly anti-communist platform. While politicians can certainly have secrets, a lifetime of deep-cover espionage for a cause he publicly despised seems wildly out of character. It's a great plot for a movie, but as a historical explanation, it collapses under the slightest scrutiny. Then there's the assassination theory. Was Holt silenced? Perhaps by the CIA for wanting to pull Australia out of Vietnam, or by some other shadowy agency for reasons we can only guess at. Like the spy theory, this is fueled by a total lack of evidence. No credible threats were ever recorded. No whistleblowers have ever come forward. No deathbed confessions. Nothing. It exists purely in the vacuum created by his disappearance. People look at a powerful man who vanished, and they assume a powerful force must have been responsible. It's a natural human instinct to seek patterns and purpose in chaos, but there is simply no data to support the idea of a hit. This forces us to circle back, away from the thrilling conspiracies of spies and assassins, to the place where it all began. Cheviot Beach on a Sunday morning. And when you strip away the noise, the most powerful, logical, and evidence-backed explanation is also the most tragically simple. Harold Holt died by accident. Let's build the case. First, consider the man himself. We've established his almost pathological love for the ocean and for risk. He was a man defined by a kind of cheerful recklessness. He spearfished for sharks, he held his breath to impress friends. He swam in places others wouldn't dare. His friends and family all described this trait. It wasn't a death wish, it was a life wish. He felt most alive when pushing his own limits. On that day, he was showing off just as he always had. He saw the churning, rough sea and saw not a threat but a challenge. A chance to prove, perhaps mostly to himself, that despite the stress and the pain, he was still the same vital, powerful Harold. It was an act of ego, of hubris, of a lifetime of getting away with it. Second, consider his physical state. He was not the robust man he projected to the world. He was 59 years old, exhausted from a grueling year as Prime Minister. He had a recurring shoulder injury that could have flared up at any moment, incapacitating him in the water. He was on pain medication. He was, by any objective measure, not in peak condition to battle a treacherous sea. His spirit was willing, but his body was weakened. And third, most importantly, consider the ocean. The witnesses weren't exaggerating. They described the water as a boiling cauldron. Cheviot Beach is notorious for its dangerous rip currents, powerful, fast-moving channels of water that can drag even the strongest swimmer out to sea in seconds. The tide was high, the surf was violent. It was, as one local later put it, a day you wouldn't let your dog swim in. Holt, in his overconfidence, fundamentally misjudged the power of the water. He had swum there many times before and had always won. He assumed that day would be no different. So picture the scene. A man, overwhelmed by the pressures of his job and his life, seeks a moment of release in the one place he feels truly free. He ignores the warnings of his friends. He wades into a sea far more dangerous than he realizes. He's hit by a powerful wave, or caught in a vicious rip current. His bad shoulder gives out. He's pulled under, dragged out, and in a matter of moments it's over. No submarine, no assassin, no note. Just a man, an ocean, and a single fatal miscalculation. This explanation, accidental drowning, is the one accepted by his family, by the police, and by virtually every serious historian who has studied the case. It's not as exciting as a Cold War defection. It lacks the satisfying narrative closure of a conspiracy, but it aligns perfectly with everything we know about Harold Holt's personality, his physical condition, and the lethal environment he entered that day. So why does the mystery endure? Why do the conspiracy theories persist over half a century later? The answer is simple and profoundly human. There was no body. Without a body, there is no finality. The story has no last page. That physical absence creates a void, and our minds rush to fill it with stories. The more elaborate, the better. It's hard for us to accept that a person of such immense national importance could be erased from the world so randomly, so pointlessly. A conspiracy, in a strange way, is more comforting. It suggests that his death mattered, that it was part of a larger, more meaningful plan. The alternative, that he was simply swallowed by an indifferent ocean, is far more terrifying. It reminds us of our own fragility. It tells us that no amount of power or prestige can protect you from a moment of bad judgment or a force of nature. Harold Holt's legacy is now permanently intertwined with his disappearance. In Australia, his name became a piece of rhyming slang. To do a Harold Holt means to bolt, to disappear unexpectedly. The nation he led was thrown into a state of shock and grief, forced to confront a type of bizarre, unresolved tragedy it had never experienced before. Security for Australian prime ministers was significantly upgraded in the aftermath, ensuring no leader would ever again be so vulnerable. In the end, the story of Harold Holt is a haunting cautionary tale. It's about a man who flew too close to the sun, or in his case, swam too far out into the storm. Whether his final act was one of desperation, as the suicide theory suggests, or one of supreme overconfidence, as the accident theory holds, the result was the same. He went for a swim and was consumed by the very thing that gave him so much joy. The ocean that he loved, that he saw as his playground and his sanctuary, became his tomb. And in the absence of a body, all we are left with is a story. A ghost story that haunts the Australian consciousness. A permanent question mark hanging over a rugged stretch of coastline. A prime minister, a father, a husband, a man reduced to a mystery forever lost to the deep.